Thank you all for coming today. For those of you that don't know, my name is Ramya. I'm the Citizen Science Coordinator for the Key Biscayne Community Foundation. We do monthly lectures on environmental issues and science-related topics, things like that, for education for the public. During the school year, we usually have a lot of students here, for those of you that haven't been here during the school year. Today we have with us Dr. John Van Leer. He's a professor at RSMAS, and he's going to talk about some current legislation that's before the U.S. Congress that has to do with carbon pricing. And it's the first time in 10 years that it's bipartisan legislation, actually agreeing on something. So with that, I will hand it off to Dr. Van Leer.
Well, thank you. Yeah, before I actually begin to talk, I have this TED Talk that's canned from Greta Thunberg. She is an extraordinary 16-year-old Swedish girl who has Asperger's syndrome, and it does not permit her to candy coat things or to speak in subtle ways. Most of us have some consideration for the people we're speaking to, and we'll soften the message so that others won't be offended. Well, Greta can't do that. And when it comes to climate change, it's rather appropriate. And the other thing I will say is that young people realize that they're getting the dirty end of the climate stick. We burned all the oil and the coal and the gas, and we built up a very comfortable lifestyle, while at the same time ignoring what it's doing to our only planet. And so Greta is going to say this message in a less subtle way than I will. So this is motivation for what follows, so that you'll know why you should pay attention to what I'm saying about carbon pricing.
When I was about 8 years old, I first heard about something called climate change or global warming. Apparently that was something humans had created by our way of living. I was told to turn off the lights to save energy and to recycle paper to save resources. I remember thinking that it was very strange that humans, who are an animal species among others, could be capable of changing the Earth's climate. Because if we were, and if it was really happening, we wouldn't be talking about anything else. As soon as you turn on the TV, everything would be about that. Headlines, radio, newspapers. You would never read or hear about anything else, as if there was a world war going on. But no one ever talked about it. If burning fossil fuels was so bad that it threatened our very existence, how could we just continue like before? Why were there no restrictions? Why wasn't it made illegal? To me, that did not add up. It was too unreal. So when I was 11, I became ill. I fell into depression. I stopped talking, and I stopped eating. In 2 months, I lost about 10 kilos of weight. Later on, I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, OCD, and selective mutism. That basically means I only speak when I think it's necessary. Now was one of those moments. For those of us who are on the spectrum, almost everything is black or white. We aren't very good at lying, and we usually don't enjoy participating in the social game that the rest of you seem so fond of. I think in many ways that we autistic are the normal ones, and the rest of the people are pretty strange. Especially when it comes to the sustainability crisis, where everyone keeps saying that climate change is an existential threat and the most important issue of all, and yet they just carry on like before. I don't understand that, because if the emissions have to stop, then we must stop the emissions. To me, that is black or white. There are no group. I don't understand that, because if the emissions have to stop, then we must stop the emissions. To me, that is black or white. There are no group.
Oh, maybe you can go past that spot. Okay, and then yeah, that's good.
Rich countries like Sweden need to start reducing emissions by at least 15% every year. And that is so that we can stay below a 2-degree warming target. Yet, as the IPCC have recently demonstrated, aiming instead for 1.5 degrees Celsius would significantly reduce the climate impacts. But we can only imagine what that means for reducing emissions. You would think the media and every one of our leaders would be talking about nothing else, but they never even mention it. Nor does anyone ever mention the greenhouse gases already locked in the system, nor that air pollution is hiding a warming, so that when we stop burning fossil fuels, we already have an extra level of warming, perhaps as high as 0.5 to 1.1 degrees Celsius. Furthermore, does hardly anyone speak about the fact that we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, with up to 200 species going extinct every single day. That the extinction rate is today between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than what is seen as normal. Nor does hardly anyone ever speak about the aspect of equity or climate justice, clearly stated everywhere in the Paris Agreement, which is absolutely necessary to make it work on a global scale. That means that rich countries need to get down to 0 emissions within 6 to 12 years with today's emission speed. And that is so that people in poorer countries can have a chance to heighten their standard of living by building some of the infrastructure that we have already built, such as roads, schools, hospitals, clean drinking water, electricity, and so on. Because how can we expect countries like India or Nigeria to care about the climate crisis if we, who already have everything, don't care even a second about it or our actual commitments to the Paris Agreement? So, why are we not reducing our emissions? Why are they in fact still increasing? Are we knowingly causing a mass extinction? Are we evil? No, of course not. People keep doing what they do because the vast majority doesn't have a clue about the actual consequences of our everyday life. And they don't know the rapid changes required. We all think we know, and we all think everybody knows, but we don't. Because how could we? If there really was a crisis, and if this crisis was caused by our emissions, you would at least see some signs. Not just flooded cities, tens of thousands of dead people, whole nations leveled to piles of torn down buildings. You would see some restrictions, but no. And no one talks about it. There are no emergency meetings, no headlines, no breaking news. No one is acting as if we were in a crisis. Even most climate scientists or green politicians keep on flying around the world, eating meat and dairy. If I live to be 100, I will be alive in the year 2103. When you think about the future today, you don't think beyond the year 2050. By then, I will, in the best case, not even have lived half of my life. What happens next? The year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children or grandchildren, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you, the people who were around back in 2018. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything, while there still was time to act. What we do or don't do right now will affect my entire life and the lives of my children and grandchildren. What we do or don't do right now, me and my generation can't undo in the future. So when school started in August this year, I decided that this was enough. I sat myself down on the ground outside the Swedish Parliament. I school strike for the climate. Some people say that I should be in school instead. Some people say that I should study to become a climate scientist so that I can solve the climate crisis. But the climate crisis has already been solved. We already have all the facts and solutions. All we have to do is to wake up and change. And why should I be studying for a future that soon will be no more, when no one is doing anything whatsoever to save their future? And what's the point of learning facts within the school system, when the most important facts given by the finer science of that same school system clearly means nothing to our politicians and our society? Some people say that Sweden is just a small country and that it doesn't matter what we do. But I think that if a few children can get headlines all over the world just by not going to school for a few weeks, imagine what we could all do together if we wanted to. Now we're almost at the end of my talk. And this is where people usually start talking about hope. Solar panels, wind power, circular economy, and so on. But I'm not going to do that. We've had 30 years of pep talking and selling positive ideas. And I'm sorry, but it doesn't work. Because if it would have, the emissions would have gone down by now. They haven't. And yes, we do need hope. Of course we do. But the one thing we need more than hope is action. Once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So instead of looking for hope, look for action. Then, and only then, hope will come. Today, we use 100 million barrels of oil every single day. There are no politics to change that. There are no rules to keep that oil in the ground. So we can't save the world by playing by the rules. Because the rules have to be changed. Everything needs to change. And it has to start today. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think that sums it up. Where we are or we are not. I mean, the question of what do we do for the future is a really critical one, and the fuse on this dynamite is very short, which means you got to be very careful what you do, and you have to do things importantly. Would you advance to the first slide? Okay, so this talk is about the problem of political will. We know about climate science very well. I have some wonderful colleagues at the University of Miami who study it daily. I've studied it for like 45 years. And while it's not perfect, our knowledge, by any means, it is really quite good in terms of knowing what we need to do. We have to cut emissions, and we got to do it decisively, we got to do it drastically, we have to do it now. And so that's the thing we've got to do. And in order to do that, we have to effectively engage Congress. And we have to do it in a bipartisan way if we're going to have a solution which will stick past one administration. Not enough to do things by executive order, because as we have clearly seen, the administration changes, the executive order changes, because the executive changed and you're back in the same spot which we were to begin with. So, so this is an image we've been seeing a lot on television lately, the 50th anniversary of men walking on the moon. This was Apollo 8, which was a couple of years before we actually walked on the moon. But it was an amazing event for people to see the whole Earth on television, all in one shot, in the background of space. When you're on the Earth and you look up through the atmosphere, it seems like it's a blue sky and space goes forever. But it's just this thin, paper-thin layer of gases over the surface of the Earth, and it's the only place that people have lived since the beginning of mankind for any length of time. So this created the first global awareness about how small, how unique, and how essential our home planet is. We have the best real estate in the universe that we know of. There may be something in a distant galaxy someplace that's comparable, but we don't know about it yet, and we don't know how to get there. So we should be taking care of the real estate that we presently have. And that was something that came from this exposure. Within 2 years, we had the Clean Air Act, we had the Clean Water Act, we had the EPA established, and this was in the time of Nixon. We had the first Earth Day, and when Nixon looked out the window and he saw 500,000 people walking past the White House carrying signs and chanting, he said to his colleagues, he said, I bet half those people are Republican. If I want to be reelected, I better do something. So I don't think Nixon was especially a tree hugger, but he certainly signed the legislation that came across his desk to great effect. And so in truth, Nixon is the greatest environmental president in recent times. He's not generally remembered that way, but he did do that. I thought this was an interesting slide. This is the famous Keeling Curve, which shows the increase in CO2 since 1958. So when I graduated high school, Keeling started measuring CO2 on a mountain in Hawaii called Mauna Loa. And a couple of interesting things about this curve. One of them is there's an annual oscillation. During half the year, the CO2 goes down. That means that the Earth's natural systems are absorbing CO2. Unfortunately, during the other half of the year, CO2 goes up, and it goes up more than it went down previously. And that is because we are burning and continue to burn those 100 million barrels of oil plus a lot of coal and other things, and that is filling up that paper-thin atmosphere. So what this has on it, beginning of atmospheric CO2 measurements, first climate model for the entire Earth was here in the 1970s. And you see all these different things that have happened. ExxonMobil predicted global warming at this time. Shell Oil was long before them. The Charney Report was before all of this. And so there's no mystery about how global warming happens. You add more greenhouse gases, you interfere with the outgoing radiation, and the planet warms. There's no mystery about that. It's not some kind of voodoo science. It's very real. And so we see things like, here's the first funding of climate denial institutes. So when this became a problem for their bottom line, they said, well, we better invest in the solution. But in their case, the solution was to distort the facts so that we wouldn't do it. And so then the founding of the IPCC, COP21 in Berlin, Kyoto Protocol. You may remember these things. Gore lost to President Bush. The Nobel Prize to the IPCC, COP21 in Paris, and you see the CO2 is still going up. And a climate denier becomes US president, and then a climate denier becomes the president of Brazil. And I don't know about Boris, the new Prime Minister of England, what his view on climate is, but if I were to take a guess, it might not be very different from those other two presidents. So the CO2 is still rising, and this is the point that Greta was making with all these pronouncements, all these organizations, all this study. We still haven't had action. And in order to have action, we have to change the rules. So next, please. So you might wonder why it's taken so long to make progress protecting our climate. Well, a group of the world's financially richest companies make money selling the product that we're trying to slow down, and they are spending about $1 million on every member of Congress to be sure that they understand the viewpoint of the fossil fuel industry. And so they have practically unlimited lobbying cash. They make an 8,000% profit on that investment of $1 million per congressman because you get all these benefits that make producing fossil fuel cheaper. So we're incentivizing the thing that's wrecking our climate. And of course they have this very effective disinformation campaign using the methods that were pioneered by the tobacco lobby when it was found out that cancer resulted from cigarette smoking. They set up a disinformation campaign with people wearing white coats, lab coats, looking like they were doctors or scientists, and essentially spreading disinformation about that. Actually, the sugar industry was ahead of tobacco. Interestingly, some of the same physical people are spreading the disinformation about climate. Can you imagine? I mean, that's a long career, well-paid career. They could probably retire someplace comfortable. I don't know what's going to happen to their grandchildren. We could speculate about that. Next, please. So we have had a global environmental problem which we have solved. The so-called Montreal Protocol was negotiated when it was discovered that CFCs were making a big hole in the ozone layer, which protects us all from solar radiation that might damage our skin and give us skin cancer and have other effects. And so they discovered that they could do this using what was called a cap and trade system, where they limited the total amount that could be put up. And then they would trade they put a value on it, and by increasing the value every year, they could reduce the total size of the cap and reduce the amount of emissions. And that actually worked in terms of reducing the size of the ozone hole. So we've had an international agreement based on economics that actually produced a reasonable result. So next. So the next time, there was the bipartisan work in climate greenhouse gases occurred 10 years ago, and they proposed a cap and trade system proposed by Waxman and Markey. So that was the last bipartisan climate legislation that was active on Capitol Hill. So it's been a decade ago. I didn't like cap and trade as well as I like putting a price on carbon, but it was the only game in town, so I went up to Washington with 30 other scientists from the Union of Concerned Scientists and a like number of top drawer economists, and we pounded the halls of Congress for 4 days. We got it through the House of Representatives, then it narrowly failed in the Senate. And that was Obama's first and last serious shot at economic changes to emissions. Most of my colleagues, my scientist friends, think I'm nuts to continue to work on this problem when there are so many disadvantages. These well-entrenched fossil fuel interests and their great amounts of money, they think I'm on a mission impossible. And but if people like us who understand it don't work on this, then who will? And the question is, what is the most effective policy to have, and what organization makes the most sense? It might be a different answer for each one of us, depending on our personality. Here's an ecosystem. This is not all of the advocacy organizations, but it's a pretty fair list of the more effective ones. Union of Concerned Scientists, United Nations with the IPCC, Society of Friends, the Quakers are very active in this. 350.org, founded by Bill McKibben, has worked very long and hard on divestment, which is shaming people who own stock in carbon companies into selling off their stock. This is a process that was very effective in South Africa during apartheid. People who were investing in South Africa were shamed for doing it because they still had apartheid. And so this is essentially a page out of their playbook. And then Sierra Club and Nature Conservancy have been around for a long time. The Drawdown Project is extraordinary. They've actually done the numbers on what we do to reduce emissions by reducing carbon emissions or sequestering carbon that has already been emitted. And then they calculate what the price will be over 3 decades. And if you do all 80 of the fast ramping solutions, which they modeled, you make $44 trillion compared to business as usual. So even if there were no climate crisis, we should do this for the money. Now, it stimulates the economy. Of course, there's Greenpeace. Our Children's Trust is a group of 21 children that are suing the federal government for denying their future, basically the issue that Greta outlined. And this is her hashtag Fridays for Our Future. She had a student strike that had 1,600,000 students in it, and it got almost no publicity in the United States. Of course, there was a shooting at a mosque in New Zealand that just happened to happen on the same day that stepped on the story. And of course, a mass shooting obviously gets priority over the future of the world. So anyway, you haven't heard the last from Greta, that I can tell you. And then Citizens Climate Lobby, which is an organization that I've been working for the last 5 years. I've been teaching global warming for 45 years, probably closer to 50 now. And I've worked with most of the organizations on that list at one time or another. And CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby, I think has the most compelling and effective solution to the problem based on economics. This is sort of looking at the thing from the large scale. So we have 3 different things here. We have rules, which are laws. We have tools, which are essentially the techniques for reducing carbon emission or increasing sequestration. Those are the tools that we can use to solve the problem. And then we have goals, which are the aspirations. And the Paris Climate Accord, because it has no enforcement mechanism, is essentially one of the aspirations. And the UN has a series of sustainable environmental goals, and those are also aspirational. There is no enforcement mechanism. And then the other thing is the rules. So the order in which we do this is we need to fix the rules, because that will unleash the tools, and then we can achieve the climate goals, the aspirations. That's the order in which this thing almost certainly has to proceed. And so we need to put a price on pollution, and I'm going to describe the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which is legislation that is now pending in the United States House of Representatives, which at last time I checked had 55 co-sponsors, including 4 from the Ways and Means Committee, which is one of the 3 committees, probably the most important one that they have to pass muster with. So it's been introduced twice, once in the lame duck session, and now again in February, and it's working its way through Congress. Next. So economics is the way to do this whole thing. So I thought it was appropriate to start out with an economic statement. This is something that was originally published in the Wall Street Journal, January 16th, 2019, so it's pretty up to date. And this was originally published by 27 Nobel laureate economists, 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve, 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors, 2 former secretaries of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And now there are over 3,000 economists, academicians mostly, who have signed up on this. So the economists think that the way to solve this problem fast enough at a big enough scale is essentially to correct the price. I apologize for the small print, but this is how they put it in the article. Global climate change is a serious problem calling for immediate national action. Guided by sound economic principles, we are united in the following policy recommendations. 1, a carbon tax offers the most cost-efficient lever to reduce carbon emissions at a scale and speed that's necessary by correcting a well-known market failure. That is, they don't count in the price the damage that's done by the emissions. By correcting this market failure, a carbon tax will send a powerful price signal that harnesses the invisible hand of the marketplace to steer economic actors towards a low-carbon future. A carbon tax should increase every year till emissions reduction goals are met and be revenue neutral to avoid debates over the size of government. A consistently rising carbon price will encourage technological innovation and large-scale infrastructure development. It will also accelerate the diffusion of carbon-efficient goods and services through the economy. A sufficiently robust, gradually rising carbon tax will replace the need for various carbon regulations that are less efficient. Substituting a price signal for cumbersome regulations will promote economic growth and provide the regulatory certainties companies need for long-term investment in clean energy alternatives. So up to now, with changes of administration, there will be subsidies in one administration, they'll be snatched away in the next. The people in the solar business call it the solar coaster. There's a word for it. So to prevent carbon leakage and to protect U.S. competitiveness, a border carbon adjustment system should be established. This system would enhance the competitiveness of American firms that are more energy efficient than their global competitors. It would also create an incentive for other nations to adopt similar carbon pricing. That's a really important thing. It is not US warming, it is global warming. And so in order for this to be effective, the legislation has to have provisions which draw other countries to come aboard. So to maximize the fairness and political viability of a rising carbon tax, all the revenue should be returned directly to US citizens through equal lump sum rebates. The majority of American families, including the most vulnerable, will benefit financially by receiving more in carbon dividends than they pay in increased energy prices. So that is the basic economic underpinning for the legislation that Citizens Climate Lobby has been working on for the last decade and is designed so it could be supported by people not only in the Republican and Democratic Party, but also libertarians and others as well. These are the folks from Citizens Climate Lobby. The first year I went to Washington in 2015, there were only 900 of us lobbying Capitol Hill. It was the biggest lobbying day in the history of the Republic. And so this last year there were 1,500 of us, and there are about 140,000 members internationally. And the membership has been growing like a hockey stick. So if you're going to fight CO2 that's rising like a hockey stick, then you better, if you're going to play a game of hockey, you better have a membership that looks like a hockey stick as well. I have to say, one of the most inspiring things is to be surrounded in a big auditorium by 1,500 people who not only care about the future, but they're out there on their own nickel trying to make it happen. And we give scholarships to the young students because, as you've seen in Greta's case, young people were actually in many ways more effective spokesmen than the old farts like me. So next. So these are the people behind the plan. George Shultz is in the middle. Gary Becker on the left is a Nobel Prize winning economist, and on the right is Mark Reynolds, who's our executive director nationally. This organization has about 60 or 70 people full-time for a membership of about 140,000. So you have to say it's a lean organization. It's gauged by charity rating organizations as being one of the most efficient organizations in this space. So these guys are key to it. And of course, Schultz was Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury. He was Secretary of everything during the Reagan and Bush years. And he's still alive. He's working at the Hoover Institute out at Stanford, which is arguably the most conservative think tank on the planet. So it's very simple. It's a policy on a postcard. You replace the subsidies and regulations with a simple fee on carbon content of fuels. You rebate all revenues to households, and then you let the free market work. Yeah, I mean, we live in a capitalist society. Some people might like that, some people might not. It really doesn't matter because we still live here. And so we have to have something that makes economic sense in a capitalist system if it's going to be embraced by capitalism. And if it is not embraced by capitalism, it's not going to happen. So this is a difficult dance. Next. So these are some of the economists who have been in favor of it. So at the present time, fossil fuels appear to be cheap compared to clean energy by a little bit. In fact, that little bit is shrinking every day. So every time you double the amount of solar panels that are built, the price goes down 20%. So this is a trend that's been long established. And they appear cheap because they don't count the damage that's done. Next. So this shows you the high price of cheap energy. And this does not count, well, it does have some political risk. So sea level rise if you live in Key Biscayne, infrastructure loss, property loss. Our property values are already feeling a bit of this heat. There's saltwater intrusion in our aquifer with another 2 feet of sea level rise. We'll start doing reverse osmosis desalinization because our aquifers will all be contaminated with salt. And of course, there are water shortages, extreme weather, which we've seen in abundance in the last decade. Business disruption, every time there's a hurricane, you're not doing business. And the healthcare costs, and of course, the defense and security costs here. When you depend on renewable energy, you don't have to protect it in the Straits of Hormuz, for example. So, of course, there are major healthcare costs with the high temperatures we've been seeing in the United States and in Europe. That has real healthcare costs. Next. So, the reasons that economists like carbon fee and dividend is it's market-based, it's revenue neutral, it's technological neutral. It doesn't make choices as to what methods you use. It lets the market do that, and it stimulates the economy. So the surprising economics, it creates 2.8 million net new jobs. It grows the gross domestic product and real disposable income, and it saves order of 13,000 lives per year, mostly people who live in the vicinity of coal-fired power plants who have to breathe that fine particulate matter, or live near expressways where diesel trucks that are inefficient produce very small particles, which are terrible. And it cuts emissions faster and further than the EPA regulations proposed in the Obama administration. So this is maybe the most important slide in this deck. The top curve is business as usual with CO2 emissions continuing to rise. The next curve down is the EPA proposal, which was going to reduce emissions by 30% by 2030. And then this yellow curve is the fee and dividend, which exceeds the EPA targets where that arrow is, and it goes down over 90% by 2030.
And that's at $10 a ton?
That's $10 a ton, going up by $10 every year, $10 every year, $10 every year.
Oh, so by 2030, if we were to get it, it would be
yeah, it's going to be
$100 a ton?
Yeah, so yeah, and $1 a ton is roughly equal to a penny a gallon at the pump in round numbers. So if you remember during the gasoline increase a few years ago, when gas was pushing $4 a gallon, the Hummers disappeared pretty much from the ecosystem, and the Priuses and their gas-sipping counterparts grew. So this is the growth in employment. Of course, this started in 2014 in the model. This is done by REMI, Regional Economics Modeling Incorporated. Next. So what Citizens Climate Lobby is about is creating political will for a stable climate. And it does this by empowering ordinary citizens to know how to do the lobbying, how to be effective, so that they can basically put their shoulder to the wheel and help this. Numbers matter a lot. Getting endorsements from the county of Palm Beach recently endorsed our legislation. That's a pretty big deal. You know, individual cities like Key Biscayne or the city of Miami working on city of Miami. There's going to be a hearing on the 12th of September if you want to go down there and say to our elected officials that they should be doing something active. That would be good. These are the milestones towards Mission Impossible. This is what the organization has already accomplished. So September 2015, all Republican Gibson resolution asserting that climate change is real, humans are largely responsible, and Congress has an obligation to mitigate it. Introduced with 14 Republican co-sponsors, led by Representative Carlos Carbell from the Florida Keys, and it was introduced 2 days before Pope Francis gave his address to the joint session of Congress. So I coordinated with the Archbishop of Miami, and he got to see the text several days before it was released to the public, and he had an article of support in the Catholic literature so that the then Speaker of the House, Boehner, who was an ardent Catholic, might see the light. Or maybe the Archangel Gabriel would come down through the overhead while the Pope is speaking. I don't know. But we wanted to have some legislation on the floor that could be voted on in case that happened. So on the 16th of February, Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus was formed, U.S. House of Representatives, again led by Carlos Carbell, Republican, and Democrat Ted Deutsch from Palm Beach and Broward County. Had 45 Republicans and 45 Democrats working together. This is the basis of the bipartisan cooperation that we are hoping for. And it was recruited using the Noah's Ark method, 2 by 2, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat. So if you're a Democrat, you want to join, you got to bring a Republican or vice versa. In fall of 2017, thanks to Paul Hawken and hundreds of Drawdown Fellows from the Drawdown Project, they did the math to show the way home, to show that it is possible to reverse global warming, and it is also profitable. So we have essentially a plan to execute that's based on very conservative assumptions. In October 2018, Justin Trudeau announced that Canada will implement a national carbon price by 2018, starting with $20 a ton in 2019, going up $50 a ton by 2022. So that's the deal in Canada. Our brothers and sisters in Canada were crucial in getting that legislation through the gauntlet. In February 2019, we reintroduced the bipartisan Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Bill, HR 763. I can't tell you how nice it is to actually have a bill introduced in Congress that you can refer to by number. It's not a vague concept. It's a piece of legislation. It's a beautiful set of rules to make this thing happen at a speed roughly equivalent to what the IPCC has told us we need to do if we want to have a 1.5 degrees C rise in temperature. This is Carlos Carbell in the middle. Greg Hamra from the CCL chapter in Miami. He's our group leader, and myself. We went down to hear him speak in the Middle Keys and to offer some support. I drove down south when he was running for re-election to essentially thank him for his leadership on climate. And we are not a political organization, but it's awfully helpful to have a couple of crucial Republican leaders in the House of Representatives. So when they redistricted South Florida and they did the latest round of gerrymandering, they made his district more Democratic, so he'd be less likely to be elected. Think about that for just a minute. I'm explaining to Ileana Ross-Laitman, your former House member, Republican of Miami, that during 1988, during the Cold War, I was measuring the ocean north of Siberia under the pack ice for anti-submarine warfare purposes. She was very conservative, very anti-Russian, having come out of Cuba. And so that got her attention. Then I told her that the ice was melting on the underside, even though the atmosphere was 40 degrees below zero. And so that got her attention. So the guy listening so intently with the white hair, I'm the guy facing Ileana, that's Jay Butera. So this is the historic meeting. Julie Lambert on the left from FIU unfortunately had a cerebral hemorrhage and she's no longer in the fight. Craig Hamra, our leader from Miami, Jay Butera, CCL senior staff. He founded 3 successful companies and sold them, and so he is independently well fixed. So for the last 12 years, he's been doing nothing but work on Capitol Hill regarding climate change before CCL existed, and he's working on some additional software to support the cause. In his right hand, you see some sheets of paper. That was essentially a polling of her district showing that 82% of her constituents want action on climate change. And one of the more interesting tidbits is that Hispanics on average are more concerned about global warming than Anglos. Think about that. Yeah. God bless them. Yeah, so next please. So this is our last meeting with her in 2018. You might notice a couple of Key Biscayne residents, Michele Drucker and her son Colin over there in front of the American flag. It went from being skeptical to this one was like old home week. And I told her that we were working for her little granddaughter, cute little girl who was in her office at that time. And she really came around. Unfortunately, she retired, so we lost another friendly force. Next. So this is the basics of it. It's effective. The policy will reduce America's emissions by at least 40% in the first 12 years and 90% by 2050. It's good for the people. It will improve lives and save lives from air pollution reduction. In addition, carbon dividends put money in everybody's pockets to spend every month as they see fit. So done by direct deposit, like you got another Social Security check if you're in my situation. So it's good for the economy. It creates 2.1 million new jobs thanks to economic growth. And those jobs are in the local communities. So that money recirculates in your community. And it's bipartisan, so the Republicans and Democrats both on board co-sponsoring this bill together. The majority of Americans support Congress taking action on climate change, including more than half the Republicans. So solving climate change is too urgent to get it caught up in bipartisan or in partisan politics. So it's revenue neutral. The fees collected on carbon emissions will be allocated to all Americans to spend any way they choose. The government will not keep any of the fees that are collected. That's what it means to be revenue neutral. A number of people who favor regulations take issue with this idea. They don't trust the people with the money. On the other hand, half the people in Congress are roughly Republican, So it means that they like this idea. So there's got to be some balance, and this is one of the ways of balancing. So how does it work? The carbon fee is assessed on fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. It starts low and it grows over time and will drive down the carbon pollution because energy companies, industries, and consumers will move towards cleaner, cheaper, and more efficient options. The carbon dividend, money collected from the carbon fee, is allocated in equal shares every month to the American people to spend as they see fit. Each adult in a household gets a full share. The children in the household get a half share up to 2 children. So there's a border carbon adjustment, and this is a key thing to bring other countries on board. It protects U.S. manufacturers and jobs by putting an assessment on imported goods at the border based on their carbon content. And so goods that are exported from the United States receive a similar refund under this policy, so they're not disadvantaged in a foreign market where they don't have a fee like this. Next. So there's a regulatory adjustment. This period, the policy preserves effective current regulations like auto mileage standards, but it pauses the EPA's authority to regulate CO2 and equivalent emissions covered by the fee for the first 10 years. After this policy is enacted, if emissions targets are not being met after 10 years, Congress gives clear signals to the EPA to regulate those emissions to meet the targets. The pause does not impact EPA regulations related to water quality, air pollution, and health or other issues. This policy, the price on pollution, will lower carbon emissions far faster than pending EPA regulations. As you saw in that graph with the yellow curve essentially running away from the EPA emission. Next. These are 4 carbon pricing bills that have been talked about. There's only 2 that have been introduced. The lowest curve is the Carbell Curve, which was mostly to finance infrastructure. The idea being to curry favor with the White House by spending money on infrastructure, which the president has not figured out how to finance. But because it builds out infrastructure, it also increases emissions. So it's kind of a self-defeating thing. It had a small adjustment for climate impacts, increasing the infrastructure for sea level rise mitigation. That was one thing for South Florida. The steeply rising one is the CCL curve, which is called the W.H.O.I legislation, since he's the originating co-sponsor, HR 763, and you can see the price goes up and continues to go up the most steeply of all those things. So it's the most effective one. And if the emissions have not gone down sufficiently, the increase per year goes to $15 a ton at the end of those 10 years. So here we are with 1,500 volunteers on the steps in 2019. It is an exciting thing. We lobbied 529 offices on Capitol Hill. All but 6 offices did we count on. Everybody that would have us, we were there. And we lobby not only on Capitol Hill, but we lobby in the home district. So when the Congress people are home, we call on them. We know them very well. We know what kind of dog biscuit their dog likes. It gets very, very specific. So the lobbying starts off, there are usually about a half dozen people in a lobbying meeting. The most junior person will often be the timekeeper. So all they have to do is make sure we don't abuse the time limit that the congressperson or their staff has set. And then we have somebody that does the thank you, thanking the congressperson for something good that they have done. So you start the meeting on a positive framework. And then you have somebody who does the ask, who asks for the thing that we want. In this case, it's probably going to be HR 763, since that's the legislation that we're pushing. So, and somebody who is just getting into the game, we might give them an easier bar to jump over the first time. And then at the end of the meeting, the note taker essentially reads their notes and everybody comments to see whether we got it accurate or not, and then that's entered in our database. So if you didn't go to the last meeting, you can read what was said, what was positively responded to. So it's very scientific, it's very fine-grained, and it allows analysis by a central group. So here we are after the change. We're lobbying Representative Donna Shalala, and it's the Miami group. The lady on the left is Kelly Dawson, who's absolute dynamite, and Greg is on the right side here. And we thought she was going to become an endorser. She asked us to write an op-ed for the Herald that she could sign. So it seemed like we were really going to do it. But then the Green New Deal came along, and she didn't want to get out ahead of that. So she's been putting on the brakes. So if you all want to give her a call or write her a little note or something saying, hey, your constituents would like this, that would be greatly appreciated. So this is the last slide. You can ask your congressional representative to support energy innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And this website, energyinnovationact.org, gives you all the details that you could possibly want on this legislation. Google Citizens Climate Lobby and see what we do. That'll be very constructive. All kinds of training literature on the site. Or you can go to our next Miami chapter meeting in the Unger Building, room 230 on the main campus at the University of Miami in Coral Gables. And it starts at 11:30 and it ends at 1:30. It'll be on August 10th. And Corbin Schaus, who is one of my students from last year's Sustainable Living class, will be leading the intro. Dynamite young guy. Oh my God. There's some really good young people coming up through the system, and that's what gives me hope if we're going to have this whole thing work. So that's it. There is no more, said old St. Peter as he shut the door. Yeah.
Assuming you get it past Congress, will
Yeah.
Mr. Trump sign it?
Well, yeah. I don't know. He'll wake up at 3 in the morning with his Twitter finger twitching, and I don't know which buttons he's going to push. Yeah.
Is there any indication that?
Well, it hasn't gotten through the House yet, so he doesn't have to make any decisions. But I think we have a very good chance by the end of this congressional session to have it through the House. And then we had companion legislation introduced in the Senate. We have to find a new sponsor for that in the Senate. So that's the next order of business. And according to Sheldon Whitehouse, who's been a consistent climate hero in the Senate, there are between 10 and 20 Republicans who want to do something significant on climate change. If we could have a veto-proof majority, if enough of those folks would join the cause, and of course it's not entirely on the Republicans. There are some Democrats from petroleum or coal states that are still dragging their feet and putting their heads in the sand. So.
Okay, now I wanted to ask if there were going to be subcategories under the fossil fuels such as deforestation and the tribal industry that's also...
It all based on emissions. So each type of fuel per ton or barrel or cubic foot has a certain amount of emissions. And so the emissions are what are taxed. And so that's adjusted depending on which fuel it is. And so tar sands, which wasn't mentioned, are by far the least efficient fuel of all. So the beauty of this, as the price starts to bite, the most expensive things to produce, like tar sands, will be the first to go. And then the offshore oil production, which is probably the next most expensive, that will go. So economics will dictate which reserves fossil fuel companies try to exploit. And so it'll start making the most expensive and least efficient ones suffer first, and it'll grind this thing down. It'll be, I think, amazingly fast. And the amount of renewable energy that's growing in this country is just utterly stunning.
Transportation that's going to be hard to replace are airplanes.
Well, yeah, I mean, airplanes use a lot of fuel, so they're going to be one of the first things to go. I think there'll be a lot more meetings online. For example, we don't all have to fly to California to talk to somebody. So that's where the market will work on things. Of course, we'll have, at some point, we'll have transcontinental travel in evacuated tubes, so we'll be able to go at Mach 2 or 3 So that's in the works.
So all those prices will increase.
Yeah, all that stuff will happen faster once the price of carbon goes up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What was Representative Shalella's resistance?
Well, she's concerned that we pause the regulation that Obama put in place, that would look bad for her if she would endorse that. Of course, the fact of the matter is it has never been enacted because Trump basically paused it when he came into office, permanently tried to pause it. So it's not in force, so we're not stopping something that's doing something effective right now. We're pausing something that's never been started. And so the Green New Deal has garnered a lot of attention, and that's a good thing because it makes people aware. The unfortunate part of it is that it also asks for about 6 other things at the same time. And so the more layers that you have to pass, the less likely you are to get anything passed. So we've been curating this bill for 10 years. We've been pampering it, patting it on the bottom, burping it, bringing it along, and we would like to see this get legislated before the end occurs. Some familiar faces. Yeah, Jackie Gross has played soccer with my daughter on the 14 and under team in Key Biscayne back in the late Pleistocene.
No years.
Yeah, some very familiar faces. Yes.
Question. If and when HR 763 gets passed or the Senate version,
Yeah.
does CCL have any plans for next steps?
There's going to have to be things on carbon sequestration.
An adaptation maybe? Or?
Yeah, and of course, if you put the price on carbon, that's going to help that along anyway, but we want to have some specific legislation that gives incentives for carbon sequestration because it's not enough just to stop emitting. We have to start sucking the stuff out of the atmosphere. Obviously, things like planting trees, low tillage farming. It turns out that most of the CO2 we have in the atmosphere came from fossil fuel burning, but it also came from oxidizing carbon that are in farm fields. Every time you run a big tractor with a giant plow over the field and you dig up and turn over the clods, you're exposing the carbon that's in that soil to being oxidized. And that's not good. So we have to reinvent agriculture, and we have to start rewarding farmers like the Amish who sequester carbon every year as part of their normal process. Those guys should be paid a premium because they're doing good for the whole planet.
I wasn't familiar with the Amish.
Well, they do a lot. They don't use chemical fertilizers. They have cows, they have horses that pull their plows, such as they have. They don't plow deep, and they add fertilizer as they go, as it were. And they do well-rotted fertilizer too. So they take care of their ground. So if you take a shovel full of soil out of an Amish field, it looks black because there's so much carbon in it. And in Iowa, for example, if you look at the height of the land in graveyards compared to a farm field next door, about 6 or 8 feet different. And that difference is due to the carbon that's been oxidized out of that soil by modern farming practices. Yeah, so there's a lot to do. And get a copy of Drawdown and see what the recipes are. The food sector is the most important one, next to controlling refrigerants. A lot of the refrigerants we made to solve the ozone hole problem are actually very aggressive greenhouse gases. So while solving one problem, whoopsie daisy.
One at a time then.
Yeah. So anyway, but it's exciting, and to have actual legislation moving on the Hill, I can't tell you how long it's been, 10 years since we saw any real movement, and it's bipartisan. That's the beautiful thing. In Alaska, there's what's called the Alaska Permanent Fund, which refunds money generated by the oil companies with the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And so every Alaskan gets an annual refund. And that makes that pipeline very popular. If we were to get refunds to the American people, good luck on repealing this thing, ever. That's the hook that will set this whole thing. Yeah, that's the deal. So,
Have you thought about rebranding the the legislation as the Trump carbon dividend?
If it would make a difference, by God, we'd do it. Anything. But it is exciting to see this stuff actually move.
It is different from carbon market in California?
Yeah, the carbon market is a cap and trade.
Yes.
And like the European cap and trade system, they started with an absurdly low price on carbon. So it's taken years and years. It's finally starting to bite. So it's finally getting to be effective, but by God, it's taken like 15 years to ramp up. So now the thing about cap and trade is you actually have to do a lot of accounting. You have to figure out how many tons of carbon are in a pine tree and things like that. This is just doing accounting on cash flows we're already monitoring. Yeah, so the Social Security system knows how to give direct deposit refunds to people. We don't have to reinvent that wheel. That's really efficient. And we already monitor the amount of oil that flows through the various pipelines and across the borders at ports. We know how many barrels of oil or cubic feet of gas cross. So, and we keep track of that. There are some fees charged on already, so it's just a matter of a little bit of software. Corbin Schuss could calculate that and implement a program by close of business tomorrow that would do that. It's not not rocket science. Yeah. So anyway, look at Greta. She's dynamite. She's got it right. God bless her. Oh my God. Plain spoken, just simple, plain prose, clear.
Perfect English.
Yeah. So it's the number 6 thing in the list for drawdown is educating women and girls. Incredibly important. And the 7th one is family planning. If you put those two together, it's the most important thing that we can do to control global warming. It is absolutely critical. And managing our food and our food waste, converting from animal agriculture. I had a vegetable sandwich as I requested from Ramya. Don't want to set a bad precedent here in front of the public.
I mean, we hear a lot about, that book Drawdown is amazing. And one of the things too to take away, I tell my kids is, stop eating hamburgers, for example.
Yeah.
Hamburgers, fast food hamburgers is
I mean, for people like us, it's not particularly good to eat those things to begin with.
But they seem to keep popping up everywhere. Hamburger joints, like they're still on the rise.
Yeah.
And if you haven't tried it, there's this new product called Beyond Meat, and I swear it tastes just like a hamburger.
Yeah.
They sell it at Golden Hog. It's amazing.
What is it?
I don't know what it is. It's plant-based.
So if you want to take this to the next level, look at Citizens Climate Lobby and come to one of our meetings. I think it'll be a game changer.
August 10th.
Yeah, so the 10th of August over at the University of Miami. If you go to our website, if you go to CCL website and look for the Miami chapter, it all comes up. No secrets. It's the most transparent website going. Everything is exposed, so
Thank
no
you very
secrets.
much.
Thank you for the enlightenment.
Well, thank you.